Translate this for $10 million. Or admit you don't belong in this room. The sentence didn't just land. It sliced clean through the soft jazz, the crystal clinks, the quiet arrogance hanging in the air like expensive perfume. Every fork paused midair. Every conversation collapsed into silence. High above Manhattan, on the 62nd floor of a glass tower that reflected more power than sunlight, the private dining room of Aurelia Steakhouse became something else entirely, a stage. And at the center of it stood Naomi Carter, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her tray balanced perfectly in one hand, her expression calm in a room that suddenly wasn't. Richard Sterling leaned back in his chair like a man who had never been told no. His navy suit fit like precision engineering, his silver cufflinks catching the light with every subtle movement. Around him sat investors, executives, men and women who moved markets with a glance, all watching now, not because they cared about the waitress, but because they sensed entertainment. Richard smiled, slow and deliberate, sliding a folded document across the polished walnut table. "Go on," he added, louder this time, making sure every ear in the room caught it. "It's just a translation. Should be easy. If you understand anything beyond the menu." A ripple of restrained laughter followed, thin and sharp, the kind people use when they don't want to be the only one not laughing. Naomi didn't move. Not yet. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, just enough to feel the weight, just enough to ground herself. She had heard tones like that before. Not the words, the tone. The assumption. The quiet decision someone makes about you before you ever speak. Across the room, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline built on ambition, steel, and silent competition. Down below, traffic crawled like veins through the city. Up here, everything was controlled. Or at least that's what Richard believed. Because tonight wasn't just dinner. It was negotiation. A $500 million international merger, wrapped in legal language dense enough to hide anything. Mistakes, leverage, or something far more intentional. Naomi had been moving between tables for the last 2 hours, unnoticed, unheard, invisible in the way only service staff learn to be. But invisibility has a cost. It also has a benefit. You hear everything. Every whispered doubt. Every careless admission. Every assumption that no one like you could possibly understand. And she had been listening. Richard tapped the document with one finger, impatience creeping into his polished demeanor. "Well," he said, $10 million is a generous offer." Generous. The word hung there, heavy with irony. Naomi set the tray down slowly on the nearest side table. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Then she stepped forward just enough to enter the circle of attention, just enough to be seen, not as staff but as presence. Her eyes dropped briefly to the paper, scanning. Symbols. Structure. Language most people in the room couldn't recognize, let alone read. For a moment the room held its breath. Not because they believed she could do it, but because they didn't. And that's when the balance shifted. Quietly, invisibly, like a fault line preparing to move. Naomi did not rush, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to everyone watching, because people who bluff move quickly and people who panic move faster. But she did neither. She simply breathed once, steady and controlled, and let her eyes travel across the document as if the room, the money, and the man who had just tried to reduce her to a joke no longer existed. The symbols on the page were dense, layered, written in a hybrid legal structure that blended formal Mandarin with contractual shorthand used in high-level acquisitions, the kind of document designed not just to communicate but to confuse, to bury meaning under complexity. And for a brief second Richard Sterling allowed himself a small smile, the kind reserved for private victories, because this was the moment he expected her to hesitate, to stumble, to confirm everything he already believed. But Naomi's fingers did not tremble, her posture did not shift. Instead she tilted the page slightly toward the light, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and precise. Section 3, Clause 14. She began, and the room changed, not all at once but enough for the air to tighten. A few heads turned, one investor leaned forward, another slowly lowered his glass, because this was not guessing, this was reading. "The translation is not entirely accurate," she continued, her tone measured, almost careful, as if she were correcting a quiet mistake rather than exposing something far more dangerous. "It states a transfer of controlling interest under conditional review, but the phrasing here," she tapped lightly on the page, removes the condition entirely when interpreted under regional commercial law. Silence followed, heavy and immediate, the kind that does not ask for attention but demands it. Richard's smile did not disappear, but it paused just long enough to fracture. "That is not possible," he said, still leaning back, still performing control, but there was a thin edge now, something less polished. Naomi did not look at him when she answered. She kept her eyes on the document because the truth did not need permission. "It is," she said. "And it means whoever signs this version does not retain partial ownership, they surrender it." A murmur spread across the table, subtle but undeniable, like a ripple under glass. One of the attorneys seated near the end reached for the document, his fingers no longer casual, his expression tightening as he scanned the same line she had just read aloud. Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating but creating space because this moment was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the truth she had just placed in the center of the table. And for the first time that night, Richard Sterling leaned forward, his fingers no longer relaxed, his gaze sharper, searching not for dominance but for confirmation, for control he could feel slipping in ways money could not immediately fix. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, quieter now, the room holding on to every word. Naomi finally lifted her eyes, meeting his, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. "I listen," she said simply, and in a room built on power, it was the one answer no one had prepared for. No one spoke for 3 full seconds, and in a room where seconds were measured in millions of dollars, that silence carried weight, the kind that pressed against the walls and settled into every pair of eyes now fixed not on Richard Sterling, but on Naomi Carter, the waitress who had just shifted the balance without raising her voice. The attorney at the far end adjusted his glasses, scanning faster now, his lips tightening as he reached the same line she had pointed out. Then another, each clause unfolding like a quiet warning that had been hiding in plain sight. "She is right," he said finally, not loudly, but with enough certainty to fracture whatever control Richard believed he still held. A murmur spread again, sharper this time, investors leaning in, one of them pulling out a tablet, cross-checking, recalculating, because this was no longer theater, this was exposure. Richard's jaw set slightly, the practiced calm still there but thinner now, like glass under pressure. "That is a draft," he replied, his tone controlled, measured. "Not the final version." But the words did not land the way they were supposed to, not after what had just been revealed, not after the room had seen that something was off. Naomi remained still, hands now resting lightly at her sides, not defensive, not triumphant, just present, as if she understood something deeper than the moment itself, because she did. She had seen this pattern before, not in boardrooms but in quieter places, in late-night study sessions, in borrowed textbooks, in contracts dissected line by line under fluorescent lights that flickered more than they illuminated. She had learned that language was not just communication, it was leverage, and tonight, that leverage had been misplaced. One of the investors, an older man with a calm but decisive demeanor, leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room with quiet authority. "If this clause stands as written, then the acquiring party gains full operational control within 90 days, he said, eyes moving from the document to Richard. "Without the protections we discussed." Another silence followed, but this one felt different, heavier, more pointed, because now the room was not waiting for entertainment, it was waiting for answers. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table before stilling completely, a subtle reset, a man recalibrating. "We can revise the language," he said, but even that sounded smaller than it should have because revision meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant exposure. Naomi took a small step back, not to disappear, but to return the focus to where it belonged. She had done what she needed to do, not for recognition, not for reward, but because the truth once seen could not be ignored. Yet the room had not finished with her. "Wait," the attorney said, looking up again, this time directly at Naomi. "Can you read the next section?" And just like that, the dynamic shifted again. Because the woman they had not seen an hour ago was now the one they trusted to see what they had missed. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt but out of awareness. She understood exactly what this meant, not just for the deal, but for every assumption that had been made about her before she spoke. Then she reached forward, gently taking the document again, and as her eyes moved across the page, the room leaned in, not out of curiosity anymore but out of need, because power had changed hands, and everyone could feel it. Naomi did not speak immediately, and that pause, deliberate and controlled, drew the entire room tighter around her. Because now they were not just listening, they were waiting, and waiting meant they understood something had shifted beyond a simple mistake. Her fingers adjusted the edge of the document, aligning it perfectly as if precision itself carried weight. Then she began again, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the tension without force. Section 5 introduces a secondary condition, she said, eyes scanning line by line. But the wording here creates a contradiction with the earlier clause. She glanced briefly at the attorney who had first confirmed her observation, not for approval, but for alignment, then continued. It appears to offer a safeguard, but legally it reinforces the transfer instead of limiting it. A sharper reaction followed this time, chairs shifting slightly. A pen dropped somewhere near the far end of the table. One investor muttered something under his breath, recalculating not just numbers but trust, because contracts like this were not just agreements, they were representations of intent, and intent, once questioned, was difficult to restore. Richard Sterling remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer relaxed control, it was containment. His gaze locked onto the document now, no longer scanning the room for reactions, but searching for something he might have missed, something he could still claim. That interpretation depends on jurisdiction, he said, his tone sharper, more technical, reaching for ground he understood. But Naomi did not retreat. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, then answered with the same measured clarity. It does, she said. And under California jurisdiction, which is listed in the appendix, the ambiguity resolves in favor of the acquiring party. The words landed clean, undeniable, because they were not opinion, they were structure, the kind that could not be argued without unraveling the entire document. The attorney leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose as if the realization had finally settled. She is correct again, he said, this time with less hesitation, more weight. And that was when the room truly shifted, not in sound but in alignment, because authority had quietly moved from one end of the table to another. And it had not come from position or title, it had come from clarity. Naomi lowered the document slightly, not relinquishing it, but easing the tension she had built. Because she understood something most of them were only beginning to see. This was no longer about proving she could read. It was about revealing what they had chosen not to see. One of the investors, a woman seated near the center, spoke for the first time since Naomi had begun, her voice composed but firm. If this language remains, we are exposed, she said, looking directly at Richard, not Naomi, because now the accountability had returned to where it belonged, and for the first time that evening, Richard did not answer immediately. The delay small but noticeable, like a crack forming beneath polished confidence. Naomi stepped back another half step, creating distance again, her role shifting from center to catalyst. She had illuminated the flaw, but the consequences belonged to them. Yet even as she moved, the room did not release her. Their attention lingered, not out of curiosity now, but respect mixed with something quieter, something closer to reconsideration. Because the assumptions that had filled the room at the beginning of the night were no longer intact. They had been tested, exposed, and quietly dismantled. And standing there, no longer invisible, Naomi Carter held nothing in her hands except the truth. And somehow that had become the most powerful thing in the room. The room did not return to normal, it could not, because once certainty cracks, it does not quietly rebuild itself, it lingers in the air, in the way people sit straighter, in the way eyes stop drifting and start focusing. And now every glance in that private dining room had shifted toward Richard Sterling, not with admiration but expectation, because power, when questioned, must answer, and for the first time that night, the man who had orchestrated every moment found himself responding. Instead of directing, his fingers pressed lightly together on the table, no longer tapping, no longer performing ease, but holding still as if stillness itself could buy him time. We will need to pause and review this language, he said finally, his voice controlled but no longer effortless, and that word, pause, carried more weight than any number discussed earlier, because in rooms like this momentum is everything, and a pause means doubt. One of the investors nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the shift, while another leaned back, arms crossed, recalculating not just the deal, but the man behind it. Naomi stood just outside the circle now, no longer holding the document but still holding the attention, and she could feel it, not as pressure but as awareness, the kind that settles when people begin to see you differently, not because you asked them to, but because you gave them no choice. The attorney cleared his throat, adjusting the pages again, his earlier confidence replaced with careful scrutiny. We should have caught this, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But the words traveled. Because accountability once spoken does not stay contained. Richard's gaze flickered briefly toward him, then back to the table, then finally slowly to Naomi, and that was the moment that changed everything. Not the contract, not the money, but the look itself, because it was no longer dismissive, no longer casual, it was searching, measuring, trying to understand something he had overlooked, and for a fraction of a second, the roles were no longer what they had been. Naomi met his eyes. Without hesitation, not challenging, not softening, simply present, because she did not need to prove anything anymore. The proof had already spoken around them. The room continued to adjust, quiet conversations beginning at the edges, low voices, cautious tones, the sound of people protecting themselves from a deal that no longer felt secure. The skyline beyond the glass remained unchanged, lights steady, traffic flowing, the illusion of control intact outside. But inside, something far less visible had shifted, something that could not be reversed with a signature or a correction. Richard straightened slightly in his chair, reclaiming what composure he could. But it came back differently now, less certain, more deliberate. "Miss Carter," he said, her name spoken for the first time that evening, not as a label, but as recognition, and even that small change carried weight. "Where did you study?" The question hung there. Not as a challenge, but as an attempt to redefine the narrative he had created. Naomi did not answer immediately, because she understood what he was asking was not just about education. It was about explanation, about restoring balance in a way that made sense to him, and for a moment she considered giving him something simple, something that would allow the room to settle back into its familiar structure. But then she spoke, her voice as steady as before. "I learned wherever I could," she said, and that answer did not restore anything, it only deepened the shift because it removed the comfort of labels, of categories, of easy assumptions, and in doing so it left the room with something far more unsettling than a flawed contract. It left them with the realization that what they had dismissed as background had just rewritten the entire night. The question lingered longer than expected, not because it was complicated, but because it exposed something deeper than the contract ever could, and the room felt it, the subtle shift from curiosity to recalibration, because when someone cannot be easily defined, they become difficult to dismiss, and difficulty in a room built on control is a kind of quiet disruption. Naomi stood steady, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but inside the moment carried weight, not pressure but history, long nights spent reading documents that were never meant for her, learning systems that were never explained to her, understanding patterns that others overlooked because they never had to look that closely, and now all of it had surfaced in a room that had never intended to see her at all. Richard Sterling studied her, not as a distraction now, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and in business, unaccounted variables are where risk begins. "That is not an answer," he said. Not sharply but carefully, as if choosing each word mattered more than it had before. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in defiance but in clarity. "It is the only one that matters," she replied, and that landed differently than anything else she had said, because it removed the structure he was trying to rebuild. It refused to fit into the categories he understood. Around the table, the investors were no longer watching passively. They were observing actively, measuring not just the deal, but the dynamics unfolding in front of them, because power once challenged reveals more than contracts ever do. One of them, a younger man seated near the middle, spoke up, his voice carrying a tone of cautious respect. "How did you even recognize that clause?" he asked, not mocking, not dismissive, but genuinely uncertain. Naomi glanced briefly toward him, then back to the table, because the answer was not about impressing them, it was about truth, because it did not match the rest of the document, she said. "Language leaves patterns, and when something breaks that pattern, it stands out." The explanation was simple, almost understated, but it carried weight because it revealed not just knowledge but awareness, the kind that cannot be easily taught. The attorney nodded slowly, absorbing that, while flipping through the pages again, this time not searching for errors, but for consistency, for intent, for anything else that might have been overlooked. Richard leaned back slightly, not in relaxation but in reassessment, his earlier confidence now replaced with something quieter, sharper, more cautious, because the room had changed, and he could feel it slipping from a place he controlled to one he had to navigate. "You said there was more," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in focus. Naomi did not hesitate this time, because hesitation no longer served a purpose. She stepped forward just enough to reach the document again, her fingers brushing the edge as she turned a page, smooth, precise, practiced. "There is," she said, and as the page settled under the light, The room leaned in once more, not out of doubt now but necessity, because what had started as a test had become something else entirely, something no one in that room could afford to ignore. And as Naomi's eyes moved across the next section, the balance shifted again, quietly, steadily, like something inevitable finally revealing itself. Naomi's finger stopped halfway down the page, not abruptly, but with intention, as if she had reached a point where the words no longer needed to be read aloud to be understood. And that subtle pause pulled the room even tighter, because by now they had learned that when she stopped, something mattered. The city lights outside flickered against the glass walls, reflections shifting across polished surfaces, but inside, no one moved, no one reached for a drink, no one checked a phone, even the quiet hum of the air system seemed distant because attention had narrowed to a single line of text and the woman who had uncovered it. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly, not rushing the moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to carry weight. Then she spoke. This section references a compliance review that does not exist. Her voice remained even, but the words landed heavier than before, because now the pattern was undeniable. It cites an internal audit that is not included anywhere in the document, she continued, turning the page slightly so the attorney could see. And without that audit, the approval process is technically invalid. The reaction this time was immediate, not loud but sharp like a collective intake of breath. The attorney leaned forward again, faster now, his earlier caution replaced with urgency, scanning the reference, flipping back, cross-checking, his brow tightening as the absence became clear. There is no appendix for this, he said, more firmly than before, and that was when the room shifted from concern to realization, because this was no longer a drafting error, this was structural, intentional or not. It compromised the entire agreement. Richard Sterling did not interrupt this time. He did not attempt to redirect or soften the impact. He simply watched, his expression controlled but no longer unreadable, because something had changed in him as well, not externally, not in posture or tone but internally, in the way he was now calculating not just outcomes but consequences. One of the investors pushed his chair back slightly, not standing but creating distance as if physical space could give him clarity. If that review does not exist, then the approval chain collapses, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and another investor nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone, not to disengage but to verify, to confirm what was unraveling in front of them. Naomi lowered the document gently onto the table, her part in this moment complete. Not because there was nothing left to find, but because what had already been revealed was enough. The room no longer needed translation. It needed reassessment. Richard finally exhaled, a slow, controlled release, then leaned forward, his hands resting flat against the table, grounding himself in a space that no longer responded the way it had when the night began. We will suspend this discussion, he said, his voice steady, but stripped of its earlier ease, and that sentence, simple as it was, carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded, because suspension meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in a deal of this scale was not a delay. It was a fracture. Naomi stepped back fully now, returning to the edge of the room, but not to invisibility. That was no longer possible. Every person there had seen her, not as background, not as service, but as presence, as clarity, as the moment that changed the trajectory of something much larger than a dinner. And as the room slowly began to move again, chairs shifting, voices returning in low, urgent tones, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable. The most powerful voice that night had not been the loudest. It had been the one they almost never heard. The room did not recover all at once. It unraveled in layers, quiet conversations splitting off into corners, low voices carrying urgency now instead of confidence, chairs shifting slightly as people repositioned themselves not for comfort, but for distance, because distance meant protection, and protection was what mattered when certainty disappeared. Naomi stood near the edge of the room, her hands now loosely at her sides, no tray, no task, no script to follow. And yet she had never been more present. The manager near the service entrance glanced at her once, then quickly looked away, unsure whether to call her back to routine or leave her where she stood, because even hierarchy felt uncertain now. Richard Sterling remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the document as if staring long enough might rewrite it, but it did not. The words remained exactly where they had always been. The difference was that now they had been seen. He stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with control rebuilt piece by piece, the kind of control that comes after loss, not before it. We will reconvene once this has been properly reviewed, he said, his voice measured, directed to the room, but not commanding it the way it had earlier, because command requires certainty, and certainty had been replaced with scrutiny. One of the investors nodded without enthusiasm, another closed his folder entirely, signaling something more final than a pause. Because deals like this do not simply stop, they fracture, they shift, they remember, and trust once questioned does not return on schedule. Naomi watched none of this directly, but she felt it, the change in tone, the weight of unspoken decisions forming around her. Because moments like this do not end when people stand up, they continue in every conversation that follows, in every call made after the room clears, in every version of the story that will be told later. And tonight, she had become part of that story whether she wanted to or not. Footsteps began to move across the floor, slow at first, then more frequent, the sound of a room transitioning from performance to aftermath. Richard turned slightly as he adjusted his jacket, his eyes finding Naomi again, but this time there was no audience, no performance, no need to maintain the same distance. He stepped toward her, not quickly, not hesitantly, but deliberately, stopping just a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You changed the outcome of this deal," he said, and it was not a question, not an accusation, not even fully a compliment. It was an acknowledgement, something simpler and heavier at the same time. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged, because she understood something he was only beginning to process. "The outcome was already there," she said quietly. "I just read it." And that answer held no pride, no edge, just clarity. And for a moment Richard did not respond, not because he did not have words, but because the ones he had were no longer sufficient. Around them, the room continued to empty, voices fading, doors opening and closing softly, the skyline still glowing beyond the glass as if nothing had happened at all. But inside, everything had. And as Richard finally nodded once, subtle, controlled, and turned away to follow the others, one truth remained suspended in the quiet space he left behind. The most expensive lesson of the night had not been written in numbers. It had been revealed in a voice he almost never listened to. The last of the guests disappeared behind the soft closing doors, their voices fading into distant echoes of negotiation, damage control, and quiet recalculations. And for the first time that night, the room exhaled, not with relief but with absence, because what had filled it before was no longer there. The certainty, the arrogance, the unspoken hierarchy that had once defined every interaction. Naomi remained where she was for a moment longer, standing in the same space where everything had shifted, the skyline still stretching endlessly beyond the glass, unchanged, indifferent, as if the city itself refused to acknowledge the small but irreversible fracture that had just taken place 62 floors above it. The staff began to move again, cautiously at first, then more naturally, clearing glasses, resetting tables, restoring order to a room that had briefly stepped outside its script. But even routine felt different now, quieter. More aware, the manager approached Naomi slowly, his expression uncertain, caught somewhere between authority and respect. "You can take a break," he said. But the words did not carry instruction, they carried hesitation, as if he was no longer entirely sure what role she held in this space. Naomi nodded once, not needing more than that, and stepped toward the side corridor, away from the center, away from the table where power had been questioned and redefined. But as she walked, she did not feel smaller, she did not shrink back into invisibility, because something had changed, not in the room, but in the way the room had seen her, and once seen, truly seen. There is no returning to what came before. In the quiet of the hallway, the sound softened, the clink of glass muted, the hum of conversation reduced to a distant blur, and for a moment she allowed herself to pause, not to reflect on what she had done, but on what it meant, because it was never about proving them wrong, it was about not allowing something wrong to pass as truth. Back inside, the table had already been cleared, the document gone, the physical evidence of the moment removed as if it could erase what had happened. But absence does not undo awareness, it only hides it. And somewhere in the building decisions were already being made, calls already placed, revisions already demanded, because the consequences of clarity do not wait. They move, they spread, they reshape outcomes long after the moment itself has passed. Naomi reached the end of the corridor and stopped near a narrow window, smaller than the grand glass walls of the dining room, but real in a different way, the city lights reflecting softly across its surface. She looked out, not searching for anything, just present in the quiet, her reflection faintly visible against the glow, a reminder that she was still exactly who she had been before she walked into that room. The difference was that now, others knew it too. Somewhere behind her, a door opened and closed again, footsteps passing, life continuing, because the world does not pause for moments like this, but it remembers them, and in that memory something shifts, something grows, something refuses to be unseen again. Naomi straightened slightly, her shoulders relaxed, her breath steady, and then she turned, stepping back toward the work she had always done, not changed, not elevated, just clearer, because power had never truly belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It had always belonged to the one who understood what others chose to ignore, and that night, without raising her voice, without asking for attention, she had reminded them of something they could not unlearn, that truth does not need permission, and dignity does not wait to be recognized.